All right, here we go. This, if it's just you and me, hopefully you'll have a couple questions that I can answer. And I'm going to talk about just a couple things. Mostly, we're going to record this. I'll put it on YouTube, and then everybody else will access it later. And hopefully, we'll answer some of the questions people have about the final. So, the first is I wanted to say thank you for showing up. I think it was, of course, I can't remember him. He's an actor, he's a director, kind of a subtle, a little bit sideways humor. And he said that 90% of success is just showing up. And I think that really does help. What questions do you have? I'm going to talk about the final first. What questions do you have about the final?
Um, you said there was only 4 questions, right, to talk about.
Right.
So, like, from what I understand, we're all getting on this together. Are we, like, taking turns answering these questions?
Yes. Yeah. That's a really good question. That's exactly what the final is. And the more people that are on the Zoom call, the better. Or not Zoom, sorry, Teams, uh, because it transforms into something more of a conversation, and that's what it is. And that's why it's really important for everybody possible to get on that and get it over with. I cannot do a any calls before the time that we have. If somebody can't make it, there's a couple people that are going to be traveling, then we can do that on Saturday. But everybody, there's 18 people in this class. If we can get 16 on that call, it'll be done and over with. It'll take us about an hour, hour and a half, and your final will be over.
Nice. So, I do have a question. I will be coming home from work at 4:30. Would I be able to still hop on then?
You can get on a little bit later. We should, hopefully, we're supposed to be starting at 3:30. If you get on anytime before it's over, then we'll give you a minute and you can answer the questions too.
Okay, awesome.
So now, I can't say what the questions are, but it's not going to be a test, and everybody will have to participate somehow or another. So as long as we get those everybody to answer those 4 questions, that's you'll get credit for being in the final, essentially. Like there's two other things I wanted to talk about too. One is assignment resubmissions, and another is just concerns about some of the submissions that people have been making. And it's not an awful lot; it's just a couple things here and there. But the first one is by now several people have resubmitted quizzes and assignments, and that's what I'm hoping for because this isn't an in-person class. That's pretty much the best way to interact with me is to look at it and then resubmit. And there was one thing where I docked some points because a person didn't include some of the submission, but they wrote me back and said, well, I actually did, you just missed it. And they showed me where they had included it. And so they got those points. You know, it's not a big deal. And other people have said, well, let me explain what I was doing. And when they did that, it made a lot more sense and everything was good. So, do you have any idea how many times you could resubmit the quizzes and the assignments?
As many times?
Right, I have it set to infinite. So if you were really bored and didn't have any friends and nothing to do, you could retake the quiz an infinite number of times before the end of the term, which would take up an awful lot of your time, but you could do it. And if there's anything, if you see that you're not getting the points you want on an assignment, you can uh, fix or tell me what's going on. We can talk about it, and you can fix it or resubmit it or redo it. Some people have actually redone things, and that's perfectly fine, and you get more points that way. So that is perfectly fine. Now the other thing that I do have so that's the first thing I wanted to cover, and this may be an incredibly short meeting, But the second thing is, I do have some concerns about a couple of the assignments, a couple of the collages, a couple of the texture assignments, and some of the people that are turning things in where they've applied texture and color to this thing. There have been a couple submissions that have been really stellar, very, very well put together. And there's a couple that look like the person just kind of missed the point of the assignment. Everybody taking this class is necessary for graduation, so everybody taking this class has experience doing art. Sydney, what's your background? What kind of art have you been doing?
Um, I've mostly done sketching and painting.
Okay. So you understand the principles of organization, the principles of layout, and just aesthetics in general. When in the collage, what I'm seeing is that almost everybody are doing really good collages where it shows that they are very aware of aesthetics principles. But have been a couple of things turned in where the collage is just a couple pieces of material put down, and it's disappointing because a big part of the grade is going to be how you lay it out as an artist, and all of you guys are functioning artists, and most of you are professionals as well. And so, if you're not happy with the grades you've gotten on those tiles, just apply the principles that you've learned and used in your art career so far to them, and rework them and turn them in. Not a big deal. I've also noticed that a couple of people, I said that at the beginning of the color and black and white, that digital manipulation wasn't going to be counted. And a couple of people tried to do that anyway. And it's not a big deal. Just go back and do the real thing. So making a color collage and then putting it through a black and white filter for the black and white assignment isn't cutting it. You need to work with materials that start off black and white. Now, one thing you can do is go online, find images, print them off on your printer, and then use that instead of magazine pages. That would be totally fine. But you're still making collages with actual material. Are you getting any sort of a reverb on the microphone?
No.
Okay. For whatever reason, my earpod thingy is echoing. It's probably because aliens are surveying us, and they're going to be really bored and very disappointed.
Yep.
So, do you understand the last assignment to do with your carved foam piece, where you're applying at least 3 different textures and a color scheme?
I think so. Just like find 3 textures, and from what I understood, 3 or more, and just put it on your carved piece and make sure it follows a color scheme. That's what I
Yeah.
understand.
And one easy way to do that is to apply the textures and then paint on top. Another easy way is to find textural material that has the colors and the color scheme you want to use. And I would recommend not having solid colors. I would recommend painting so that there is some variation. It just makes it more interesting to work on, and it makes it more interesting to look at as well. I've seen some things in the past where people have just wrapped stuff with things, and that really doesn't count as applying textures. We're looking for textual application from a sculptural perspective. We're not looking for necessarily just conceptual working. So if you, for example, want to use yarn and ribbon on your thing, what I would recommend is instead of just wrapping it with that, um, actually make a texture out of the yarn or ribbon. One of the coolest things that I've seen is somebody would, one person just got a ball of yarn and they would paint an area of their sculpture with glue, and then they started looping the yarn and pressing one part of those loops into the glue. And they would do a section, let it dry, and then do another section. And so you got all these almost feathery or fur type loops glued to the sculpture coming off. And that was a particularly interesting texture. Somebody else wanted to use crepe paper, and they were wrapping their thing with crepe paper, and they thought that that was really boring. And so they actually put the crepe paper around the whole thing and then painted it with decoupage. Well, it wasn't really decoupage. It was glue that they had Elmer's glue that they had watered down. And what that did was give a distinct, and it wasn't, they weren't trying to be completely even with it either. And that gave a very distinct, unusual texture that almost looked like a cross between human and elephant skin. And then they attached other things to that. So if you want to use things like ribbons and stuff like that, that's totally fine. I would do something with the ribbon so that it makes a textural, it creates a textural process. Another student took the ribbon and cut it into 2-inch lengths and just glued the ends of those 2-inch lengths on. So again, it looked kind of like an alien type fur, and that was really fascinating. Somebody else got a whole bunch of glue sticks and used their glue gun in the kit, and just they did something that looked kind of like a network of spider web with a hot glue on it. Then they spray painted that. They did another layer, spray painted that, and built up like about 3/4 inch thickness in an area of different layers from their glue gun. And each layer was painted a slightly different color. And that was absolutely fantastic. You get the translucent, you get the visual translucency of the glue. And then the paint, because it doesn't adhere evenly to the glue, was doing some very interesting things. So these are some ideas that are really good. So if in that project, if you've already turned it in and I made some disparaging comments and didn't give you the grade you wanted, readdress it and look at it. There was another person that thought it'd be kind of cool to do, I can't remember her name. I think her first name is Annika. She's from Northern Europe, but she uses a lot of those cake candy decorations and a lot, so you get these little silver and gold balls of different sizes. And you know what I'm talking about, the different kinds of things you might get at Walmart along the cake decorating aisle or out Wilton store or in the Wilton decorating area of like Michael's or something. And she just covers her things with these uh, cake decoration items. These little, basically they're candies. But what she does that's really interesting is she'll do ribbons of things of similar size, paint them, and do ribbons of a different size and paint them. So you get this very interesting textural quality made out of tightly packed globes, essentially, that have a paint on it, and it ends up looking like almost like coral. And it's absolutely fascinating. So if you're going to be doing something like putting on jingle bells or bubble gum or googly eyes, and one person did coat their entire thing with different sizes of googly eyes, and I tell you that was rather distressing to look at for any length of time. But you could do that, paint them, and do something different with them. Maybe even paint your sculpture a contrasting color. Then, when you apply these things, paint them after you apply them, or even before you apply them, and see what that does. Use spray paint. Use paint that you apply with a brush. See what happens. There's all sorts of different kinds of things that you can do to get those textures. If you work in an area or live near an area that where you have access to sawdust, almost every wood shop has at least 2 different grades of sawdust. You get more of a powdery, and then you get more of thing that shows the wood curling. And I would use both of those. Maybe those are 2 of your textures. Put in on a patch of hot glue, press the wood shavings or the sawdust into that, and add patches like that around until you get a good area, and then maybe spray paint that. See what that looks like. And after you spray paint that, let it dry. Spray paint it again so it builds up a little bit of a strength. The paint itself with the sawdust begins to generate a texture, and then you can use acrylic paint on a brush and paint over that. And that, if you do contrasting colors or colors that are light underneath and dark on top, what that will do is give you a very interesting texture that's not only built on the physical texture, but also gives a strong visual component as you see the 2 different contrasting shades or hues of color. So these are all ideas. So what I really would like is if you've already submitted your image and you didn't get the grade you wanted, go back over and readdress it with these kinds of ideas and see what kind of things you can come up with. One person submitted something where they cut like feathery type shapes out of paper and used the imagery that was already printed on the paper as part of their color scheme. And that was really fascinating. One piece of advice I would have for this is if you think you're done, add more. And then if you think you're done with that, add more again. Look at the time. If you've only spent a couple hours, keep working on it, keep adding more, experiment, and see what you come up with. What is disappointing when I say things like 3 or more textures and a color scheme, what's disappointing is when somebody just limits themselves to 3 textures. Maybe think of 3 different kinds of textures. Go to DI, for example, and find a couple of plastic kids' toys, go home, use a saw, and cut those up into slices, and use that as a texture. Most of the plastic kid toys are going to be hollow. Cut that into slices, you get a whole bunch of really interesting looking rings. You can spray paint those and then apply them so that they overlap like scales. That would be absolutely fascinating. And it would also be a commentary on the state of children's toys too. But what other kind of ideas do you think somebody could use? I'm not talking about for your own project, just ideas that this kind of conversation has generated that you think might be fun for somebody to try.
One thing that I'm thinking of is like getting like leaves and grasses from outside and putting that on, or maybe even some various like, if possible, soft bark to put on as well. That would be kind of cool.
I think that would be really cool. If you could apply the grass a couple different ways, or the leaves a couple different ways, or the bark a couple different ways. One thing that is absolutely fascinating is to think of things. In northern Alaska, there's a native tradition called they're the basically we would call them stick apes, essentially, but they're these supernatural animals that use sticks that have fallen in the forest or grass that have fallen on the tundra to make bodies for themselves, and they will track the unwary down. And if you don't have strong ancestors, they'll suck your blood. But those kind of traditions are really, and in the Northwest U.S., the continental U.S. So I'm thinking northwestern Idaho and northern Washington. There's stick Indians is one of the traditional folklore names given to a version of Sasquatch who has so much dirt in his fur that it almost looks like the fur is made out of grass and stuff you'd find on the ground. So, thinking of things like that, that might make what you're talking about, that might make for a very fascinating texture where maybe you put down a strip of glue, add the grass to that, let it dry, put another strip of glue down, and add the grass to that. So you get these kind of overlapping ribbons of texture. Maybe the bark is played on almost like you'd see a side of a pine cone, where it overlaps kind of like the pine cone needles. And maybe with leaves, you think of that as some weird fish scale. So those could be really cool textures. Leaves that are spear point shapes, like basil is a good example, would make very cool scale shapes. But also, you get the 7-point Japanese maple leaves. That would look fascinating. There's several different kinds of flowers that have different shaped leaves that would look really interesting. Sycamore leaves would make for very fascinating scales. So there's lots of different kinds of stuff. And what about doing a couple rows of scales of leaves and a couple rows of scales from bark, and then tufts of grass or something, and then doing alternate layers of that. That would be really fascinating. Using those as kind of textural ribbons around your sculpture to invite people to walk around it and look at it from different sides. And then, after that dries, you could spray paint it, and that would look really fascinating. That's a really good idea. Any others?
Um,
Somebody
kind
did use human
of
hair once.
what?
Somebody did use human hair. That was pretty disgusting, but it was
Oh.
cool.
Yeah, like my other ideas I'm thinking of is just like with yarn and like leather and fabric, just random fabric from clothes and blankets and stuff. Just kind of thinking how that could be incorporated onto the sculptures.
What? That's a really cool too because do you remember Judith Scott's work? She's the woman who wrapped things in different things like yarn and rope and stuff like that. Um, if you go to DI or raid your roommate's closet, I'm sorry, that is completely hypothetical. I would never advise anybody to raid the roommate's closet without permission from that particular roommate. But if you get some old ratty clothes and just tear them into strips so that you have that ragged edge to it, and even run that through the dryer a bit so that ragged edge is even more pronounced. You could wrap an area of your sculpture, put a line of hot glue down, wrap it with that stuff, and then just do a couple wrappings so that you see at least one of those edges as you wrap it up. You get kind of that Judah Scott wrapping vibe and a ribbon across it, but it also makes for a really distinctive edge that can be fascinating. As long as you tear the fabric, it makes a really fascinating edge. If you cut it with really good, high quality scissors, it's not so interesting. But yeah, that's a good idea. Um, I would recommend if you're going to use fabric, tear it into strips and use those rather than trying to dress your sculpture like a doll. I think that'd be really boring very quickly. That would get very boring really quickly. Um, any other ideas?
No, nothing else coming to mind.
Another idea might be getting a couple packs of really cheap pencils, colored pencils or regular pencils, sharpening the ends of them, snipping them all off at about an inch long, sharpening what's left, snipping it off an inch, and just getting a whole bunch of pencil ends like that, and then using your hot glue to just glue those so they come straight out. Now, all of those are going to be sharp, but when it all goes together like that, it starts softening it up and visually, and it starts looking almost like a really weird alien coral texture. So that would be something else too. That would be interesting. But I think between us, we've come up with some really good ideas that I think both of us will be very disappointed if we don't see any of them in use by the end of the term. But those are excellent. So again, if people have already turned in their stuff, they're not happy with their grade, revisit it, readdress the texture, look at what I wrote down, and think about it, and add that whatever I said, add that or respond to it with what you do to your sculpture. If it took you 30 minutes to prep this and apply the textures and apply the color, that is not long enough to do pretty much anything. Unless you're a French aristocrat trying art for the first time, setting up your easel behind a jet engine and throwing buckets of paint at it, um, for anybody else creating something that quickly, it's not going to have really good results. If you're a French aristocrat, you have enough money, you can get away with it. One other thing I wanted to mention, and then I wanted to revisit the final again, is the artistic critique. Do you understand what I've been talking about with that Tools of Artistic Critique page? The 4 steps of the process?
I think overall I do understand. Yeah. I don't really have any questions personally about it.
Okay, well, would you mind helping me review it really quick for our ancestors and progeny that eventually watch this video? Excuse me. Um, what are the 4 steps? Do you remember them?
No, not at the top of my head.
Okay, the 4 steps are designed to each build on each other. And the first step involves very little of who you are. And the last step is mostly your side of the equation. So the first step is describing what you've seen, guessing how big it is, what kind of style it is, looking at the materials, talking about what colors it is, all the physical attributes that make that thing unique. The second step is interpreting. I'm sorry, not interpreting. Excuse me. The second step is analyzing. And with the analyzing process, you're kind of extrapolating how you would make the textures that are shown, and you're kind of guessing at what those textures might be or how they may have been made. The third is interpreting, when you're kind of overlaying your own guess at the artist's ideas, what they were trying to express, what they were trying to address in the piece. And then the fourth one is judgment or evaluation, where you're deciding whether or not this was successful for what it is. So the second one, the analyze, each of these parts of the process have different questions about it, and there's a couple different questions under each of them. So in analysis, maybe you could talk about, it looks like this part was made out of melted wax, which would not be really good if the artist intended to display it in a park in St. George. But maybe they're saying something about the ephemeral nature of reality. So that is kind of a combination. The first part is analysis, and then when they're saying something about perhaps, that slides into interpretation. But in analysis, you can also talk about with the jagged lines evident. It looks like this is linked to some sort of strong emotion. With the smooth lines evident, this looks like it was the artist took care to make this perhaps a little bit more calming. And then when you get into interpretation, that's when you can start saying the jagged lines make me wonder if the artist who did this was angry, or if they're addressing or they're just dealing with personal issues revolving around an angry roommate. Or the smooth lines are obviously this. Well, it appears to me that this artist, when they were making this piece, was very calm and sedate, um, and happy with where they were in life, and wanted to make something that would provide for a happy environment. And the last thing is judgment or evaluation. And if you're doing an artistic critique on something that you really don't like, this is where you state, I can tell that the artist had a lot of really strong intent, and I think they did a good job communicating a lot of their emotion and ideas through this. I just don't happen to like it. Now, did you watch the video where the 2 art historians are talking about Henry Moore's reclining figure?
Mm-hmm.
When you first saw it, what was your first reaction to it, that piece? At the very beginning of the video, when you first see it?
When I first saw it, I
My
think
first
that
reaction to that sculpture was revulsion. About
what
30 years ago, when I first saw that sculpture, I was revolted. I thought it was nauseating.
yeah, my first thought was something like, this is weird. I think
Yeah,
something like that. This is a weird sculpture. Yeah.
perhaps feeling that it was almost inaccessible, maybe. Um, as you go through this process, what's interesting is that you're asking yourself questions that help you to see something more intently. One of the stories about Columbus coming to the Americas is that the first island that they made landfall on, the spiritual leader of the community saw the ship. It took them about 3 days between when they first sighted land to when they were actually close enough to get the boats out and actually get on land. Uh, and one of the stories from one of the Catholic monks who interviewed a lot of the people involved was that the spiritual leader for the community saw something disturbing on the horizon. He had no idea what it was. He was asking other people in the community to see if they had a better idea, and he said that none of them could even see it. Staring at it and staring at it all that day, he could not figure out what it was, and finally he thought maybe it's a large canoe. And this spiritual leader said it was unusual because all of a sudden he could see what looked like a very large canoe with people on it. And then he asked other people in the community, see that it looks like a large canoe, and then people could actually start seeing a ship that had already been on the horizon for over a full day. I don't know if you have siblings, because I know that you're not the kind of person that would do it yourself. So when somebody sometimes will look in the fridge for a jar of pickles and say, oh, I can't find it, and then you go over and look and it's right in the middle of everything and you can see it. We get this kind of, if something isn't exactly how our brain expects to see it, sometimes we honestly cannot see it. It's not because we're dumb, it's not because we're ignorant or not paying attention, it's because our brain is not ready to see it. And the reason why I say all that is as we go through this process of articulating what we see, a lot of the times it helps us to change how we view and how we interact with it. Did you notice any sort of a process by the end of that 6 minutes looking at Henry Moore's reclining figure? Did it still feel alien and weird to you?
I just remember being like impressed about the historian's process of describing the figure and analyzing what it could mean or represent. I don't remember what I felt about the piece itself.
Right, but there was something of a change at going through the process. I appreciate that. I remember. So the first time I saw it, I was revolted. As over the years, I've looked at it again and again, and one of the things I admire is that it's a plaster piece, but it feels to me like it's really ancient ivory. You know, the coloring and the texture, and then looking, he's put string, embedded string, into the plaster surface, and the string is discolored during the process. And it, I think, noticing the rather straight and almost mathematical placement of some of the areas of string into that ivory quality of the plaster made it more visually interesting to me. And looking at it closer, and then seeing that Henry Moore is showing multiple aspects of the same figure at the same time. It was just one human woman who modeled for him, but it almost looks like the model that he's using is undulated over time, so that he's showing different time periods of the process of remodeling in the same figure almost. And I loved what the art historians were saying about um, how it kind of reminds them almost of an insect kind of thing, basking in the sun. And I love those kinds of perspectives because then it gives you permission to layer your own responses on top. And I think one of the things that makes art transcend from just junk is the fact that we can actually have a conversation with it within ourselves. And on some level, we can almost feel like we're interacting with whoever made the artwork. And by going through this process, I think it also helps us to articulate some portions of that process. So it helps us to link more with this other creator that we're starting to converse with through the art that they've made. But I think it can also help us to validate the expenditure of our time at looking at something that's unfamiliar to us. So I'm hoping that everybody, as they go through this process, kind of gets that. And the comments that I've seen on the discussion board for this part of the assignment have been really well articulated. Have you read any of them? I would
No.
recommend just going on the discussion board and reading what some of the students have said about other people's work, because they've done a really good job going through this process, and it will help everybody else in the future. So, if I gave like a specific word count, consider that the minimum, and I would even write it out in a Word doc, look at it later, rewrite it, and then type that in to the discussion, so you've had a chance to really think about it or articulate what you think. And this is particularly interesting when you do it for a piece that you don't like at the beginning, but then you end up really enjoying after you go through the 4 steps. And that becomes very interesting. But I wanted to talk again about the final. We can't do anything earlier than 3:30. You're going to be coming in late, so you will be probably answering all 4 questions at once. But that'll be just fine. And the final is basically I have 4 questions. Everybody goes through and addresses each one in the class. Then we start with the second question, go through, everybody answers that, third question, and like that. That will be the process of the final. So again, it's Friday, August 12th at 3:30 in the afternoon. So what is going to be frustrating for somebody if they email me sometime in September and say, hey, I got a grade lower than I expected because I completely missed the final, it will be because they never bothered talking to me about working through the final at a different time. So I have had somebody email me 6 months after the end of a class asking what had happened when they never bothered communicating with me before then. So don't be that person, please. Do you have any more questions, Sydney?
I don't know.
All right, great. Then I will end this really quick, and I will post it on to our YouTube channel and email that link to everybody. All right. Have you been able to watch the lectures through the YouTube
I have
link?
been.
Okay, good, excellent, great. Because I see that 11 or about a dozen, maybe a little bit more people have seen that, and I highly recommend that everybody look at that, because this will help with people to understand the assignments and different things like that.
Does help.
All right. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Try not to get arrested unless it's worth it. I'm sorry, I'm an instructor. I shouldn't say that. Don't get arrested.
Okay. Have a great weekend yourself.
All right. You too. We'll see you later.